I'm Tom Kennedy and welcome to Uncensored Stories. Today we're welcomed by Sam once again to talk about Trump on the brain, neuroscience behind Donald Trump's popularity. Thanks for joining us, mate.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to talk about this one. What is quite a polarizing topic and an interesting one too, I think.
100%. Let's start by talking about this new phenomenon of right-wing populism, which has become so prevalent in the United States in the last few years. So essentially the idea of this group psychology, which the Republicans and especially Donald Trump has definitely incited, that there's a fear of another group or a fear of the unknown, whether that's immigrants or loss of jobs, etc. Can you talk us through the neuroscience behind this fear of the unknown, and especially in the context of group mentality?
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting question from a neuroscience perspective because it's so hardwired into us evolutionary. But effectively, when we look at the herding effect or the group mentality effect that happens in this right-wing populism, what we're seeing is an overarching identity form for a group. In this case, conservatives, whether that be the Proud Boys or whoever else within that group or that subsector of society, who then take on this shared identity. And in doing so, they take on this shared identity. They then identify with everyone else within the group and their beliefs. And so you have this herding effect where the behavior of one person therefore spurs on another and they follow each other. And it's kind of like peer pressure when you're a kid. When one person in your friendship group did something wrong or a little bit naughty, it almost gives credence for the rest to follow and do the same. And so we're seeing that on a much, much larger scale and often incited by the leader of the group, the president himself. And you'll notice with a lot of these issues, they're often around emotionally charged events or emotionally competent stimuli, as Dr. John Medina will say. And that's because when we have that level of emotional arousal, especially in a group setting where these often occur, the areas of our brain responsible for rationalization and logic and thinking, the prefrontal cortex and associated cortices, they essentially shut down, and there's more activation in the fear centers of our brain or the fear networks, including the amygdala and the insula and other regions. So really what you're seeing is people's ability to think clearly is being reduced as they're so emotionally aroused and stimulated in these group settings, as well as the social norm evoked by those within a group they identify with, surging them on to behaviors that they maybe wouldn't have committed otherwise.
Okay. With this herding mentality, is the leader being encouraged by the group, or is the leader just influencing the group? Is the leader directing? Is the group sort of a byproduct of the leader's psyche or the leader's ego or the leader's actions? Or does the herding mentality work both ways?
It works both ways, and I think they definitely feed off each other. And what I mean by that is it's the popularity of the leader and his sway and influence over that group is in direct correlation to his alignment with their values and his representation of them in their identity. So if you think of Donald Trump in this circumstance, him embodying these values around nationalism, around protecting jobs and workers, and bringing up the marginalized and poorer, lower socioeconomic Americans in his constituents that he wins in the conservative constituencies. He represents their values and beliefs. And so he has a really, really impactful and influential sway over them because they're able to identify with him. Conversely, if he didn't identify or didn't represent those beliefs and values as much, he would not be able to impact them and kind of evoke this herd mentality as effectively. But it's also the strength of the beliefs they hold is the glue which binds them together into this group and which makes this herd mentality and this herding effect so prevalent and so powerful today, even when it's for something as crazy as the break-in on the Capitol.
So let's talk about identity. If we take away sort of social constructs on a high level of what identity is nowadays in these sort of intricate groups, what are some of the more primitive factors that we look for, maybe subconsciously or consciously, for our own identity to align with another tribe or align with a narrative of a group of people? What are some of the factors that people feel familiar with other people about?
Well, on a really primal subconscious level, we're looking for cues of similarity and trust. And these are often in the form of actions and behaviors. For example, when you meet someone who barracks for the same sports team as you, there's this instant association of trust because you both are aligned towards that sports team. So subconsciously in these group settings, when we are forming these identities, we are looking for all of these multitude of cues that make up a person in terms of their actions and their behaviors, and especially their beliefs, which is effectively, the way they act towards a certain thing in a certain situation over and over again, which embodies their beliefs. We look for cues of these and to see how they align with our own. We also take a lot of these cues from our upbringing, from our parents, environmentally. That is how we develop so much of the schemas which become our beliefs later in life. So when you have these communities that are brought up with a similar belief set, such as some of the right-wing conservatives, maybe perhaps from the Deep South or another region like that, they are subconsciously looking for other Americans who also embody and share those same beliefs. And that'll be through their actions. So for example, if you are a Donald Trump supporter through and through, and you come from Mississippi in a really, really poor region, and you go to a rally and you see another supporter with a massive sign, and it has something written on it to the effect of, we don't want any immigrants in this country, these are our jobs. You might instantly identify with that and associate that as a cue, because that's the same belief that you embody within yourself. And so then that's how that group identity and collective is able to form.
Cool. What sort of influence does conflict or the threat of conflict have on people finding their group? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes
looking for a group.
Looking for a group, looking for that safety in numbers, right? Which is a really, really primal thing. That is a great question. And that's because when we're in a condition of a state of fear, a brain state of fear, when there's hyperactivation of the amygdala, insula, and the other fear networks and threat networks in our brain, our ability to regulate emotionally and think critically is physically reduced. If we were to cut your brain in half in a period of time when you're really stressed or really afraid, what you'd see is these parts of your brain in the threat networks are enlarged, while the parts of your brain in the memory formation networks and in the thinking networks actually shrink: the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the associated cortices. And that's in response to protecting from stress. So when we're talking about it in terms of finding these tribes and these groups and these identities, when people are really, really scared, they are subconsciously seeking safety in any form they can, while also being less able to rationalize and to think in logical terms. So it's so much easier for them to identify with extremists in that situation if they present some form of identity that they deem to provide safety for them, regardless of whether their actions are crazy or outrageous or breaking into a capital. Because they're in a state of fear, and there's actually a lot of good research on this, by the way. There's a professor called Dr. Tali Sharot from the University College of London. And she's done a lot of research that show when people are in a state of fear, and they used Feynman for this. When people are in a state of fear, they will subconsciously scan their environment for environmental cues about fear, about threats. So they're kind of on hyper alert. So when you're in that state, that mindset of hyper alert scanning your environment, obviously if a group provides some form of protection from what could be possible threats, it's much easier to identify and integrate within that group.
Okay. So that makes a lot of sense. So politicians can use or can create a state of fear strategically to take advantage of people perhaps not thinking as rationally as they would be,
definitely.
and taking exploiting the fact that they are looking for comfort in numbers and sort of promoting a populist strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can see the way they manipulate it all the time, because people who are scared, and you can feel this on a somatic personal experience yourself. When you're scared, you are looking for the closest out, the closest escape from that fear and anxiety and stress. And so by triggering that fear in the greater population, they know they're going to be looking for safety and security in what they know. And often that's falling back into a belief set that the politician wants them to fall back into, whether that be Republican or Democratic or whatever it is.
And where does confirmation bias play into this? When you're in this state of fear, or when you're in this state of even comfort, I guess, from the other side, that perhaps you're already in this Republican or Democrat group, this political or social circle where you found people that share a similar narrative. When you have that comfort of that social acceptance, where does confirmation bias play a part in your interpretation of other narratives and other sources of information?
It is such a good question, and it's because so many of us don't really understand this. But in terms of interpreting other narrative, and especially facts and information, confirmation bias kind of acts like this iron dome around your belief set. And what it does is it prevents any conflicting information from coming in, from penetrating that iron dome and changing your beliefs. So even in states of fear, or not in states of fear, in states of rest, this confirmation bias is in place because it's part of the brain's natural mechanism to use what you already know, your pre-existing beliefs and memory schemas and understanding of the world, the patterns and try to fit new information into it. It's how our brain works. And this is where confirmation bias comes in, because if you believe something already, if you believe that, for example, all immigrants steal jobs, your brain is going to be actively selecting and filtering information coming into it to confirm that this is true. And in doing so,
and why is that? Sorry.
Why? That's a great, it's a great question. Why is it doing that? Because it's much easier to fit that information into its narrative in terms of cognitive effort and ease, right? So think about when you try to change your belief, you're going against repetition of a thought, of a neural pathway over time, maybe thousands of times. And as that pathway is repeated over thousands of times, it's myelinated, it becomes insulated, it becomes a high priority pathway where the information just flows. Whereas if you receive information now that contradicts that, you're trying to form a new pathway. And the brain is always in this conservation of energy mode. And it realizes that that new pathway takes more energy than the old pathway. So it's trying to preference you away from that. And that's why confirmation bias exists, because this new information is trying to change the structure of your brain, physically change the structure of your brain. And your brain is resisting that because it's a survival mechanism.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that was one of my questions. It sort of ties into that, is partisan politics, right? So like the easy black and white narrative of left versus right is a part of that, because I've thought that confirmation bias was mainly like a defense mechanism. But what you're saying, how it also is more difficult to process a new fashion of information or whatever. Does that play into part in why people just want to look at either the blanket narrative of left versus right, rather than analysing specific policy individually and sort of assessing from a non-biased perspective on each topical issue, whether they agree with something or not, because they're so conditioned into just this easy spoon-fed narrative where their brain doesn't really have to work from an analytical perspective each time, which is obviously a problem, because it means that a lot of people just blanketly associate themselves with one ideology without actually personally agreeing with a lot of that ideology's traits. Is that because it's a lot easier on the brain? Is it because they consciously or subconsciously they don't want to create these new paths and learn these new areas of policy or social issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really interesting thought, to view it as a defense mechanism. It's a survival mechanism, and like you just kind of touched on, it is because it's actually more difficult, but it's also because it expends more energy. And you've really got to think of the brain as this energy conservation machine. as we were evolved for the savannah, where we didn't have as much abundance in terms of food and calories and resources. The brain's primary job was to keep you alive. And the way it did that is through conserving and constricting your energy usage. And with the brain using up 20% of your calories on any given day, considering its tiny mass and proportion of your body, it's a really, really inefficient organ in terms of how much energy it consumes. So when it does need to change, or when you have information that contradicts the current belief and forces you to change your thinking, that requires a lot of cognitive effort. And cognitive effort represents the depletion of glucose, the usage of energy, the creation of new neural pathways, which requires myelin, which is like a fatty sheet that wraps around the axons and the dendrites, the connections in your brain. And all of that represents resources. So the brain is effectively being lazy. And when it's lazy, it chooses the path of least resistance, which is the belief you already know. And that's why we really like things that are black and white, because they're really easy for us to process. It's called cognitive ease. And that becomes a really, really bad heuristic in terms of our decision making, because often we'll assume things that are simple or make sense are correct because they're easier to process. And just like it is with these narratives and the ability for people to pigeonhole their thinking or political beliefs or ideologies so neatly into these different segments, it's because it's much easier for them to process those than it would be to challenge that thinking and expand out the neural pathways and therefore the associated beliefs, memories, and schemas in their brain. The brain is lazy. It doesn't want to change if it doesn't have to.
Okay. Hindsight bias. Can you talk us through that, and then perhaps how that might be applicable to maybe in Donald Trump's speeches, for example?
Oh, God. Yeah, absolutely. Donald Trump and Brexit, right? They're the two biggest embodiments of hindsight bias. I mean, they always say hindsight's 2020, right? And it's this concept that once an event has passed, we have this bias where we often look back and think, oh, yeah, we knew that was going to happen. Like, and the reason we do that is because we want to rationalize us being right or wrong. It's part of the brain's wanting to confirm our beliefs or our thoughts. And we're always wanting to confirm the fact that our experience or our thoughts were correct in that point in time. And that's where that hindsight bias comes. In terms of Donald Trump,
is that sorry to interrupt you? Is that a guilt thing? Is that because perhaps a part of us feels guilty and we want to assure ourselves that we did make the right decision in the first place? So if you want to confirm with yourself that you were right, even though you might not have been, is the need for that or the urge to confirm that you were right because perhaps a part of you thinks that you weren't, and maybe you feel guilty or as I don't know if that's like an evolutionary sort of thing to constantly improve to if you make a bad decision, then in your mind you feel guilty so you don't repeat it again. Is that sort of in play?
Possibly there could be some guilt in play. I'm not actually familiar enough on the psychology, the evolutionary psychology of that aspect of it. I do know from more of a neuroscience perspective and from a learning perspective, it's this concept of reinforcement learning where you're reinforcing a belief or a thought over time, and that's how you form a new neural pathway, and that's how you evolve to think, walk, and adapt. And when it comes to something like hindsight bias and reconfirming or reaffirming the fact that you were right in the moment, in doing so, it kind of gives confidence and credence to all the other things that you were right about beforehand. Imagine if we were to constantly question ourselves and our decisions and our thoughts retrospectively, we'd probably live in a state of constant anxiety, and many of us probably do. A bit of that anxiety during the next day. So I think it's these things always come.
A big night on the beers.
A big night of drinking, a couple of regrets the morning after. I mean, these things always come down to. They call it the fear. I thought it's called anxiety.
The fear in the UK. But yeah, both. Depends on what region of the world.
Yeah, it depends on which urban dictionary you've got in your hands or online. I mean, all these things, they come back to these evolutionary survival mechanisms, which were meant to optimize us to be as efficient as possible. And so with something like hindsight bias, confirming that we thought we were right retrospectively probably gives you confidence moving forwards, and reaffirms the neural pathways associated with that belief and that decision tree. And so it's more efficient than challenging that belief. Like I said, the brain's lazy. But I mean, this rationalization is really interesting because it happens with almost everything you do. Think about how many times you've bought something. It's completely different. This is consumerism, consumer psychology. How many times you've bought something and you almost don't know why you buy it. Like it might just be, like I bought a new water bottle and then I turned around and was like, oh yeah, the reason I bought that was because I needed a bigger water bottle. I had to rationalize it afterwards. We always do this. We are constantly looking to rationalize our decision. And that's because we're constantly looking to make sense and create causality for why we do things. When in reality, and this ties back to Donald Trump, that decision was probably made emotionally on a subconscious level without me even realizing or processing it. And I just rationalized it later on because the parts of your brain that rationalize things, the higher order thinking in your prefrontal cortex and the cortical levels, that's the conscious processing. You don't see all the stuff that happens under the hood, which is where 95% of decisions are made, according to Harvard professor Zogman. So I think that ties into it as well.
So there's a lot less autonomy in those decisions than one would think.
You'd be surprised that free will is a really interesting one that a lot of neuroscientists like to toss up and debate, because how much free will do we have? How much is it learned behavior? How much is it our basal ganglia, nucleus accumbens, these parts of our brains which process rewards, and they make these minute calculations every second as to what we should do next based on what we already know, what information, what we've experienced. How much of that drives our actions every day? And I think you'd be surprised at the proportion of that. I mean,
yeah, there's a good book by Sam Harris called Free Will, and it's pretty convincing. I mean, I guess I would consider myself a determinist from now, right? And determinist is like if everything's decided from the past or like hereditary or external factors.
Yep.
But like the case that he makes, which is pretty hard to argue, in my opinion, is that like the alternative is there's just like a special power that like makes these decisions for you. Like decisions aren't random. Do you know what I mean? Like you're making that, even if you think that you're making a choice, you're making that choice because of your past, your genes, and like external factors that affect your brain, right?
I totally agree with that. And I actually agree with it on a personal level too, because I can get, like, you can do this now. You can go back and have a look at some of your decisions over the last 5 or 6 months. And I think if you were to dig into them enough, you could see the roots in those decisions happening in childhood or at university or in high school. I mean, like
it's no less romantic, you know.
No,
like people think
it doesn't detract. It doesn't detract away from it, but it kind of explains it a little bit. I mean, I started a podcast because serendipitously I wrote a thesis at 16 on neuroscience. Like that was how that led me into that. But it's not like I could have predicted that, and my choice to take on that project was a direct response from that and my interest there. So, deterministic.
Yeah. And maybe you wrote that thesis because of some cosmic rays which pierced your brain. He talks about that. That was where I
got lost,
sort of hung up the boots. Yeah, that's when I realized I was a layman. Sorry, I interrupted you. The cosmic rays was my limit.
That was the tangent. I like it.
Yeah, I don't think I'm sure he didn't use the fucking term cosmic ray either.
I don't wish he had it. It would have been pretty fun. Sammy Harris.
I interrupted you when we were talking about a hindsight bias and Brexit and Donald Trump.
That's right. So Brexit was one of the most interesting cases of hindsight bias, because I don't know if you remember this. After the vote passed, the referendum, and it went through the general populace, and they said, yes, let's get out of the EU. So many people in the following weeks were interviewed on TV, and all these UK citizens were coming up and saying, I voted for it, but I didn't think it would go through. And like, it was this perfect embodiment of hindsight bias, of them being like, I didn't think it would happen. And so that was kind of the reason that I voted for it. But in hindsight, now it makes so much sense that it did go through. And so I thought that was a really interesting exchange there. When it comes to Donald Trump, though, I mean, so many of the things he said in speeches over the last 4 to 8 years were lead indicators of his behavior now. And if you were to ask, especially some of those close to him, the Republicans 4 years ago, whether they would suspect Donald Trump of becoming an extremist leader who incited violence and riots and a raid on the Capitol Hill of grand scale, they would have said no. But you ask those same leaders today, and I'm trying to remember Ted Cruz, and they would have said, oh, I knew all along. I knew Donald Trump. I knew Donald Trump was this kind of person. But the problem is, right, they have to be able to rationalize and justify their current position regardless of what they thought in the past. And then that's hindsight bias. Until something's happened and the information is conclusive, we don't have a position to justify ourselves from, and that's where it comes from. So, yeah, it's really interesting, especially with all these politicians coming out the weeds.
Yeah, it seems like it's correlated to the ego, right? And
definitely.
And like stubbornness and even narcissism, I guess, in some cases. Could you talk us through like the role of the ego and stubbornness and narcissism? And I guess, is that the same thing as confirmation bias?
Maybe not so much, but it's close. I mean, all those things, ego, narcissism, stubbornness, they all come down to this idea of identity and imagining everyone as having like a psychological body, which is like the same thing as your physical body, but a psychological representation made up of your beliefs, how other people feel about you, your values, what you respect about yourself, and what you like about yourself. And when it comes to something like hindsight bias, or when it comes to something like narcissism, especially narcissism in public, the problem is you have people attacking in these situations or trying to take down someone's psychological body. And there is a body of research out there that shows we are willing to defend our psychological body the same way we would defend our physical body. And the reason is when you try to attack someone, especially someone who's narcissistic, and bring them down, you're actually activating the same threat and fear networks in their brain as if you were coming at them with a haymaker or a broken bottle. Like there is no difference in neural response. And as a result, their body is flooded with cortisol. Their brain is releasing adrenaline. They're going into fear, flight, fright, freeze mode, getting ready to move or to do something every time you try to bring them down, especially for someone who's narcissistic. Because when someone's narcissistic, it means that their identity is huge. It's bigger than life. Their identity fits outside of who they really are, or how they're perceived by the rest of the world. And anytime you present information that contradicts that, or anytime someone, tries to bring Donald Trump down, he's obviously going to reject that because he interprets that as a threat on his psychological body, which he then defends as if it was a threat on his physical body.
Right. That's interesting.
It is. I mean, I'll give you just one quick example, right? Think about the arguments you have with people when they come at you for your beliefs or your particular stance or opinion on a situation. Usually when that happens and you start embracing that moment of conflict and it comes on, you get the sweaty palms, you get the hot flush, your jaw starts clenching, even when it's like between friends. And that's because your body is preparing as if you're going into a fight, even though they might just be, calling out your taste in music. Our brain can't differentiate the two. It can't differentiate the two, and that's the problem. And someone who's narcissistic has this massive body, and when people start pinning things to that body, of course they're going to try to defend themselves in crazy, erratic ways.
Yeah, it's strange how we don't differentiate between physical conflict and then ideological conflict.
Yep.
For a system like such a complicated system, a brain. So reason and rationale. So during like the Enlightenment period was known for like, the development of reason, right? And it seems that it like due to everything that we've talked about today, reason is becoming less and less prevalent in society, in groups and individuals, specifically for politics. So we talk about this right-wing populist ideology and strategy in group psychology and sort of demonizing another minority or a small group as a threat, and then sort of engaging more cortisol or in the brain, or engaging defense mechanisms to think less rationally, right? And then be sort of convinced of this narrative that people can be sort of roped into, and in turn get the popular vote. But the left is also doing the same thing in left-wing populism, which is massively prevalent as well in the United States, which is also trying to demonize and persecute the Republicans as this fearful enemy. So, in my opinion, that's not the right way to handle things. I mean, they won the election, but it's not promoting reason, or it's not promoting rationale, or it's not promoting a responsible evaluation of policy and leadership. It's another attack, right? How, in your opinion, can a centrist government, for example, overcome this irrational strategy which right-wing populism and even left-wing populism have resorted to in this era of irrationality? How can we get out of these games, if that makes sense, by promoting reason? Is it possible for people to start losing this easy narrative and start going down a path which is perhaps more difficult but more responsible in terms of politics?
It's a really difficult question, and that's because of the way the brain works. It would be so fantastic if tomorrow we could turn around and say, all right, from now on, we're going to take a rationalizing response to persuasion and to encouraging the population to think with more reason and logic in terms of their decision. But the matter of the fact is, with 95% of decisions on estimate being made subconsciously on an emotional basis, when you have one side or the other, whether that's the left populist or the right populist, using emotion as part of their persuasion methods, which both parties do, then if you don't use emotion, and if you don't use emotional cues, whether that be fear, whether that be attacks, then you are never going to be as effective at persuading and influencing the masses. But to counter that, there has been a lot of the use of fear, particularly in the current campaigns, and attack, and a lot of partisan politics where they're pitching against the other side. Do you remember the campaign Obama ran? Because I think one of the reasons he was so successful is he pitched around the emotion of hope. And in doing so, he elicited positive emotions as part of his persuasion repertoire, and really, really effectively ran in that campaign. I mean, he won pretty healthily in the years that he did run, and he was loved. So I think the answer is not to rely on rational reasoning, because the general population and most people, including you and I, whether we realize or not, are so heavily biased by our emotions and our feelings on situations that relying on rational arguments is never actually going to effectively persuade. And there's a great quote I love from Talia Sharot, who's a researcher on influence and persuasion. And her quote is, "Studies show studies don't persuade people." It's just the fact that facts and rational arguments don't work. And even for scientists, right? But what we could do for a centrist government is they could reframe it around using positive emotions and getting really, really competent at eliciting those. And I think of people like, Martin Luther King, who were able to rally people behind him, or Mahatma Gandhi, and unify people around the concept of hope. And so I think that's possibly the way out. I mean, we're never going to be able to completely negate the usage of emotion, because it's so integral to persuasion. Until you feel something, you can't really change your belief. It's just so integral to our decision-making processes and internal processing. But maybe we could shift towards using emotions that have a positive impact and don't incite violence.
100%. That's a really good outlook. So, like, essentially, you're saying that emotions are always going to be the most powerful aspect of persuasion. So rather than try to avoid that which is unavoidable, promote positive emotions within the populace.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. It's just like Persuasion, I can't remember who said this. Pascal said this actually. Persuasion can't
Uh-huh.
happen in the absence of emotion. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
talking of Pascal, his concept on religion was that he was a mathematician, and it's unclear whether he really did believe in like a divine power, but he promoted the idea that you have nothing to lose if you are a believer, and then even if there isn't a God, essentially, then you're going to live a better life. But admitting that, it was similar to Rousseau. It was sort of like a Machiavellian approach of like a necessary evil, which might not rationally be true, that they might not even believe in. Do you think that a lot of people nowadays, especially in the Republican Party traditionally, or the conservative politics, believe in God, essentially, that are religious for some sort of assurance, which they might not truly believe in from a literal perspective? And how much does the fear of death and the anxiety of what happens when it's all over play into the part of sort of this confirmation bias, that perhaps not rationally thinking about certain things?
Yeah, it plays a massive role. It's a really interesting thing to ponder. There's a great book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. And the premise of the entire book is that so many of man's achievements, from the Roman Empire to the landing on the moon, were in denial of death. We're in denial of our own mortality. And when you think about things such as religion and faith and hope, the one thing they provide is assurance, but it's certainty. And that's because the one thing the human brain hates the most, hates is probably the wrong word. The one thing that triggers the most stress in the human brain is uncertainty, is its inability to not predict what will happen next. And you can see this in the case of anxiety, right? People who have anxiety, or if you've experienced anxiety, I've experienced anxiety, we all have. It's always like, oh, what is going to happen? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? And effectively, it's this prediction machine within your brain on a subconscious level, being unable to predict what happens next. So much uncertainty. So when it comes to religion, whether or not they believe the scripture or the holy text, or they take it verbatim or they don't read it at all, having that belief in the afterlife provides some sort of protection against the uncertainty that is death. And that's why I think religions are really, really effectively propagated throughout the world, is they're providing certainty, and in providing certainty, they're reducing our overall stress. I mean, they did a massive meta-analysis of over 20,000 people looking at correlates of happiness and overall well-being, and religion was found, or faith was found, at number 3 as one of the things that correlated most with happiness. And that's probably because people who have faith believe in a higher purpose, but they also have this certainty of belief around death. And so they don't have that death anxiety that so many agnostic or atheistic people, even such as myself, suffer from.
And okay, that makes a lot of sense. And traditionally, religion has been associated with conservative politics, right? And what you're talking about with the fear of the uncertain for the future, is that sort of correlated to why some progressive aspects of politics the Conservative Party don't agree with, because they don't really want change. They want to keep the traditions. They want to keep these conservative values rather than these progressive new values, for example, trans rights or something like that, which perhaps pose this uncertainty, something that they don't know about, something that is not what they're used to. It's not this certainty of the norms. It's a new thing which people aren't used to, which maybe it's sort of a similar thing.
Absolutely. I think absolutely. I mean, anytime we are confronted with uncertainty on any scale, there is a minute stress response, and it's almost directly proportional to how much we perceive that to be a threat to us, our body, our identity, our group, our people. And so when you are talking about these really progressive politics, that involve a lot of change. There is so much uncertainty for the people, but there is also that conflict with their identities, which they then also defend like they were a physical body, because progressive politics around transgenderism might trigger certain people who believe transgender people are, by the holy scripture of whatever religion they follow and abide by, are not shouldn't exist on this earth. Like they're against God. They shouldn't be here. And so that's also conflicting with their identity. Plus that uncertainty means you've got this kind of perfect storm for stress, anxiety, and then those same neurotransmitters and neurochemicals released in that process are what trigger fear and hatred and so much of racial prejudice and bigotry is born from misunderstanding and the uncertainty with not knowing another race or not understanding them effectively, in my opinion. Because if you don't understand something, then you have a cause to be afraid of it because you don't know what it would do.
Yep. Thanks, mate. That's actually, that makes a lot of sense. Trump, I found it really interesting when Trump lost the elections, and then he refused to give up. He refused to acknowledge the fact that the numbers of the votes. What does that suggest about his personality? And from a neuroscience perspective, can you draw any conclusions from that?
I wish I could get inside his brain and have a look around. The one be a lot of something in there, that's for sure. The one thing I will say is it's kind of hard to comment because I don't know how much of it is politically motivated, how much of it's financially motivated. I know there was quite a lot of contention around the fact that he was still soliciting funds from his major donors and party donors to cover campaign debts during that period. So the thing I find really difficult to analyze when it comes to Trump is just how much of a facade and veneer there is, because this kind of ties into what we're talking about really well. The thing Trump has done so spectacularly, and not even a credit to him, but a credit to his media team and his communications team, is he's been able to perfectly embody people and identity, which he is not even a part of. He is a rich American from upstate New York, and yet people from the deep South think he represents them. And the reason he's able to do that is because his communication team are excellent at finding the values and beliefs and identity cues and triggers that he then uses in his speech. And this is how he creates such emotional resonance with his audience, because he propagates basically the same ideology that they're thinking internally. And as a result, they're able to identify and relate to him. They're able to integrate that information. But yeah, when it comes to something like, his identity and his behavior after losing the election, there's a possibility that, he is a known narcissist, and his inability to lose could be part of his inability to confirm that part of his identity as a loser, as someone who has lost. So he's fighting back with confirmation bias, but also he's fighting back against that threat to his identity and his own internal struggle and cognitive dissonance. Or it could just be that it was a politically or financially motivated campaign. I don't know. I wish I knew.
And what about the actual people that stormed Capitol? What do you think is good? Because what I find really interesting in these situations, right, is that the ignorance of like rational forward thinking. So whether that's people that believe in conspiracy theories, for example, who don't rationally think, they're well intelligent enough to do so, but they choose not to. So whether that's ignoring facts or ignoring consequences, ignoring responsibility, or ignoring certainty of like reality, essentially. These people that stormed the Capitol, right? They know that they're not going to fucking overtake the government or start writing legislation themselves or overturn the election results. Surely they know that. So why do people choose anyway to do these things regardless? Is it just because they're so full of emotional and it's just a reaction? or is it because they have fun in this group mentality, or is it why do you think these people do this when there's no rational outcome at all, really, other than the public display of dissonance?
Yeah, and going to jail and prison apparently with long sentences. It's when you take a toddler's toy away, even when they weren't playing with it, and they turn around and suddenly they're angry. Like, they're, give me back my toy. You weren't playing with it. Now give me back my toy. Effectively, in the human brain, like one of the things that triggers our stress response, and one of the things that is integral to our survival is our sense of control, right? It's our sense of control of our environment, a sense of our control of what happens to us, and how in control we feel in general. In fact, there's a direct correlation between our sense of agency and control in a situation and our stress response. The more in control you feel, the less stressed you feel because you can control the outcomes. When talking about this event at Capitol Hill, where they stormed the Capitol, what I see it is a rejection against the control taken back from them. They felt like they had lost control of the election, of the democratic process, and therefore this was their attempt at reclaiming it back. Much like the child throwing a tantrum after someone took a toy they weren't playing with, they've decided that to exert their control or to reclaim their control, this was the action they're going to take. And you could chalk it up to being highly emotionally aroused, incredibly charged, because like we said before, that totally diminishes executive function, your ability to think and process rationally and predict forwards and towards the future. And it also makes you much more susceptible to irrational thinking and actions. But yeah, I see it as this big, it's kind of this big FU to them losing the feeling that they were in control of the process the whole time. But that's my take on it. What do you think?
Yeah. I guess it's sort of a fear of the new tribe. So like you sort of maybe like a group is spoilt for 4 years thinking that they're the ones in control of the country.
Yeah.
And now like that's gonna change. It's not only a threat of like the uncertain, but I think that like that these people, and it's on both sides, like act emotionally without forward thinking. And I think that comes from social acceptance and the need for there to have their group or their tribe prevalent and there. And I think maybe they feel like that might be dispersed, like the Republican exclusive group, their tribe might sort of like, it's a fear of maybe they're on their own now rather than like in their group, which is powerful because they're in power, they're at the top. So I guess it's maybe like a last hurrah, like as a defense mechanism, to fight, like to be full of aggression and to fight for your tribe, even though that must be so powerful and so entrenched in us to do that it overpowers or overruns the actual rational thought process of what that's going to do, which is essentially nothing, if not just create a worse situation. Totally. And I think that happens a lot in like racism, for example, and certain forms of nationalism. People maybe feel threatened by like a new group, and then they start acting in conflict as this defense mechanism, which we talked about, like is entrenched in us, and that is so high or so powerful that people aren't actually thinking like, okay, what's this race going to do? Like, is this rational for me to act this way to a certain group? I guess maybe it's like because for 4 years they've felt this part of their ego like being sort of fueled by like their leader, like them being the top dogs. I guess, that would be my perspective.
I think it's a pretty good take on the situation. I mean, the other way of saying it's kind of just fucked up.
yeah. I saw that they were planning riots against Twitter. The Twitter headquarters.
Yeah, for burning the Don. Yeah, that
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me. The funny thing I saw about that was all the Twitter workers are remote, so they'd be writing against the janitors who have no say in the matter.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Bloody
like you
janitors.
said, I mean, the rational processing is just offline. They're all emotional arousal, all jammed up, hyped up on all the neurotransmitters out there, dopamine, cortisol, adrenaline, such norepinephrine. They're not thinking straight.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, mate. Well, did you have anything else that you wanted to speak about today?
I think the last thought to leave people with, and because this is the one that I've debated and toyed with lots of people, is why do people love Trump? It's a question. It's like, why do people love Trump? How can people believe him? Like my mom always asks me, she's like, why do people like him? He just doesn't seem like a good guy. And the reality is people love Trump because he is a master communicator. And he is a master of eliciting emotion through his language. And I'll give you a really quick example of this and then what happens in the brain. So there was a debate between him and this guy called Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson, a couple of years ago when he was running for president. And they're talking about vaccines. And Dr. Ben Carson comes out and says, Donald Trump is a really intelligent man. And when he sees all the facts and figures, I'm sure he'll agree that vaccines don't cause autism. And then Trump's response was, I had a colleague and she had a baby and this baby got this needle and it looked like a needle for a horse, this huge syringe, and it pumped him full of this vaccine and then it got really, really sick and now it's got autism. So I think that vaccines can cause autism. And right there, he won the debate, even though he had no facts to back him up. No statistics to validate him, because if you're a parent listening to that and there's this image in your mind of this horse-sized syringe going into your baby causing autism, it instantly triggers you. You feel the fear. You're like, holy shit. And so the reason people love Trump is because he made them feel. And that was a credit to his media team, his communication team. He made them feel like part of his tribe, but he made them feel connected and related to them. And he was able to elicit such an intense emotional reaction every time he spoke to the people who his message was targeted towards. So I think, for that, kudos to him. Terrible person, but kudos to him for that.
Completely agree. Okay, Sam, thanks for joining us, mate. Make sure to follow the Rocky Road Post on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and your podcasts as well, Sam.
Yep. Brain Tools on Spotify, iTunes, Google, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I'm on LinkedIn, Samuel Holston. I drop little brain nuggies here and there. Yeah, it's me.
Awesome. Thanks, mate.
All right. Thanks, mate. See you next time.